Hello, everyone. Welcome to the exclusive interview series by South Asia Research Institute for Minorities. Today, we have the privilege to have a conversation with Dr. Mohammad Shahabuddin. Dr. Mohammad Shahabuddin is the professor of international law and human rights in the Birmingham Law School. His special focus is on the history and theory of international law, ethnicity and nationalism, and human rights. His teaching and research are informed by critical, post-colonial, and TWAIL scholarship, that is, third world approaches to international law. The reason for us to arrange this interesting conversation is Dr. Shahab's landmark book, Minorities and the Making of Postcolonial States in International Law, which was published last year by Cambridge University Press. Additionally, he's also the author of Ethnicity and International Law, Histories, Politics, and Practices. He also edited an important work, Bangladesh and International Law, which was also published last year. Thank you, Dr. Mohammad Shahabuddin, for lending us your precious time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming. Thank you, indeed. Let me do a poor job, however it might be, to give a brief introduction to your book, and then we would start with the questions. So actually, as I was searching for post-colonial approaches so that I could understand human rights and minority rights from those approaches, I came across your work. And I found it very profound because it presented a very nuanced approach to the role of international law itself in creating the marginalization of minorities in post-colonial states, instead of helping it in alleviating it, actually. So Dr. Shahab in his book has argued that post-colonial states function as an ideology, and its liberal, national, and developmental aspects of functionality create circumstances that naturally put the minorities at a disadvantage. So just to help our audience get started, can you briefly explain how and why you think international law is part of the problem instead of solution for the marginalized ethnic or religious minorities in the post-colonial states?
Thank you so much. And I think you have presented the core argument of the book at the beginning in a very succinct way. I could not have done this any better. So thank you. Now, the question you were asking me, this is the question I had in my mind for last many years. This is precisely because I'm a trained international lawyer and trained international law and human rights scholar. And the general tendency that we have when we see any humanitarian catastrophe, including various ethnic conflict, marginalization of minorities across the world, the general tendency is we see these sort of things as violation of international law. And we generally think that the problem is the lack of enforcement. So the idea being, if you enforce international law, you can fix the problem. So the discourse is mainly on how and why international law was kind of in a difficult position and why that could not be enforced. Especially when the Rohingya genocide was taking place in August 2017, that was the dominant discourse among international lawyers as another failure of international law implementation. And at that time, I started thinking about, okay, to some extent, it is right that international law offers us a number of tools. If we apply those tools efficiently, then we can address some of those problems. But at the same time, there are certain areas that are informed by critical international law thinking and research, including third world approaches to international law. If we rely on those tools, then we also see the way international law actually plays a key role in making those troubles worse. Now, specifically regarding minorities, ethnic and religious, my argument that international law does, at least in three different ways, this promotion of marginalization. One is its endorsement of the colonial boundaries through the principle of uti positivitas, meaning the continuation of colonial boundaries as a default position, in a way that a good number of minority groups have been deprived of their right to self-determination, which in turn result into gross violations of human rights, in some cases even genocide. Secondly, the international law idea, which is also connected with the first point that I have made, this assumption of that so-called national state as a core constituent elements of the international order that in itself marginalizes various subaltern groups within the territorial unit. Indigenous communities and minorities would be a classic example in this regard. At the same time, it's not only that it is creating this territorial confine endorsed by international law within which minorities are being victims. At the same time, it also offers a libertarian template for the internal organization of ethnic relations since 1945 movement. This idea of this egalitarianism that everyone is citizen and they are enjoying this protection of equality and non-discrimination sort of liberal principles. So everything should be absolutely fine because we are giving equality to every citizen. And if that is the case, then why you should have something called minority in the first place? So this very language of equality and non-discrimination in a very egalitarian way in itself plays a key role in diffusing minorities as a group into individual citizens, which sounds good. But the problem is in a democratic electoral ritualist policies that we have in many countries, unless there is sudden and dramatic demographic shift in that electoral voting policies in this egalitarian principle, one person, one vote sort of democratic model, minorities will always remain minorities and they will be at the mercy of the majority who will be continue to making decisions for minorities. And as our experience tell us, not only in South Asia, all over the world, that those majoritarian politics and their own vested interests hardly work in favor of minorities. So that is second. Number three is this idea of development, which is quite a powerful idea since 1960s with the creation of the UN. The idea that whatever ethnic problems you have, it can be, these are essentially problem of poverty, problem of lack of development. So if you can ensure economic growth, if you can ensure development, those problems will go away. As I have articulated in my book that you have kindly mentioned, that was essentially the political philosophy by nationalist elites in India. Like if you study the writings of Nehru, for example, that was predominantly idea just before the independence of both India and Pakistan following partition, that it's a problem of development. If you can ensure economic growth, then people will not really fight over their religious or other ethnic identities. But the reality is the very notion of development has become a powerful tool to even marginalize minorities more. So if you, as a national state, if you have to extract minerals or create a hydroelectricity project through a dam that will submerge huge chunk of arable land, the preference is always for minority areas and resources and land, because these groups of people, indigenous and minorities, are less important in electoral politics or in terms of resistance vis-a-vis the national state. So they always go for those kind of territories and resources because it's rather easy. In a major area, it would be rather difficult if you have to think about your election 3 or 4 years down the line. So these are some of the areas. So international law offers a kind of new liberal economic template and growth model within which these sort of things are happening. And when I say international law, I simply don't mean a bunch of rules. I also include international institutions, including international financial institutions like World Bank, IMF, that play an active role in this kind of developmental atrocities. And if you look around cases all over South Asia, including also other regions of the world, but if you just focus on South Asia, you see the development projects and the damage they have caused to various ethnic minority groups across the region. So that is, in short, why I see international law as a central element of the problem as much as it's a part of the solution.
Right, thank you. I think your framework, the critical framework that you have created, will provide a baseline for further research, and I think it's very powerful. My second question is, we see secessionist movements and ethno-nationalism a problem in Europe as well.
Yeah.
So would you explain what makes post-colonial states exceptional? that you have made them a separate subject?
Yeah, thank you. So you are absolutely right. So these secessionist claims are not unique to post-colonial state. If you follow the case of the UK, for example, Scotland had one of their referenda in 2014, I think, if I'm right. And it was decided with a very slight margin. People voted for no, and they are now the ruling party in Scotland, Scottish Nationalist Party, SNP. They are now demanding another referendum. In Belgium, you have similar problem. In Quebec, in Canada, they had similar problem. But what makes post-colonial states unique in this sense is the way post-colonial states respond to those demands. In most cases, you will see those far more authoritarian, far more oppressive. The level of human rights violation, the lack of democratic dialogue is almost absent. So the question is why? The immediate concern for any post-colonial ruling elite, group of ruling elites, is always that slightest of demand for minority claims, even forget secession or outright breaking up of the state, just regional autonomy, any sort of preferential treatment when minorities demand, the nationalist ruling elites immediately see this as a threat to national integrity, which is not the case in the West because of their established democratic practices and the democratic institutions that they have historically put in place for enabling them to have those democratic dialogues through which they mitigate various tensions or at least find a way to go forward. In the post-colonial case, it is rather complex. Now, why these elites are so concerned about the very territorial integrity? And that links us back to this very notion of colonialism itself that is linked to this creation of post-colonial states. Why? The very creation of post-colonial states, and that is why I named the book The Making of Postcolonial State. These states were made in a very artificial way because the very territorial unit that was created, that post-colonial elites succeeded following the decolonization process, are very much the creation of colonial administration itself. They're the ones who created those territorial units in a way that suited their own vested interests in terms of security, in terms of revenue, in terms of administration. And even my first principle of continuity of colonial boundaries and colonial territories as a result. So the unit created by colonial administration for their own vested interest has now been succeeded by these post-colonial elites overnight. So the first challenge that they had was to create this artificial nation, if necessary by force, which then came to be known as the nation building process. The acceptance that yes, it's a very diverse nation, but this is the nation that we have succeeded from the colonial rulers. Now we have to make it a nation. And they always looked for certain glues that would bind the nation. And in most cases, those glues were offered by the majoritarian voting bloc. And that's how the various glues were defined. So in case of Pakistan, for example, you would be thinking about religious identity. In the process of creation of Bangladesh, you'd be thinking more like ethnic identity. So it's a nation for Bengalis. Pakistan would be a nation for Muslims. So if states as part of their, or in the case of India, they initially started with secular, but gradually they moved towards more, today it's more like a Hindu nation or revival of some sort of Hinduism. So if nations define their own self in that way, in itself, it will create or marginalize the leftover population who don't fit into that language. So in case of Bangladesh, it would be kind of like non-Bengalis. In case of Pakistan, that would be non-Muslims, right? So this nation building process and the artificiality of it, rather than acknowledging the very creation of the state in a very sporadic way and mosaic way and accept it, celebrate it, they didn't go for that path. They went for this wholesale nation building, homogeneous national identity sort of thing. And that is why post-colonial states are very vulnerable. And that is also why this anxiety about the very survival of the state in its current form, I think that triggers the response they offer to any slightest of demand from minorities, these are always seen as threat to national security. And when you securitize a human rights issue, real, genuine suffering of a human being, when you securitize it, it becomes a military response rather than a political response. And it is also for why, rather than having a democratic dialogue, decisions are made by army generals who will always go for more coercive measures and responses, and that makes situations even worse.
Thank you for such a elaborate explanation. It really touched my heart. As it boils down, what I understand is that international order formulated by international law in the post-colonial times has, made up the politics of international system in such a way that post-colonial states are bound in that, and that's why they act in certain ways. So, moving on to the third question, basically. So you quoted B.S. Chimney, saying that while contemporary international law is imperial in character, the possibility and benefits of reform should not be ruled out through the struggles of subaltern groups, peoples, and nations. Do you really believe that partial reforms, while the imperial and unjust nature of international law in order remains in place, will yield effective and meaningful change for the marginalized minority groups?
Thank you, Sumbul. And this is a very challenging question, and I'm not sure whether I can do justice to this, but let me try, because we have been talking about that for some time. And when I teach international law to my students in the UK, so we talk about colonial history, colonial origin, the way international law does pretty much all the troubles we see today, including climate justice. I mean, in Pakistan, I mean, a country which contributed so little to this problem of climate justice, but suffers so much because of this devastating flood. A famine is going on in Sudan now because of drought. Now, this drought is directly linked by scientists to global climate change, and things will get worse. So these are the problems created by international law, and we talk about it. Now, then my student asks, okay, so professor, what shall we do with international law then? And that is the question that any critical international lawyer, including B.S. Chimney, we had to deal with. So, okay, if international law has its own imperial origin, if it is continuing with its imperial underpinning as a tool to advance the vested interest of the powerful global north, former colonial powers, now capitalist ruling class, what shall we do with international law? Now, one can be very easily tempted to say, okay, we have to abandon international law and create our... Perhaps that is a kind of very elitist response at the same time, because walking away from international law in itself is an elitist project, because to do that, you have to have certain power and certain capacity. So in international relations, in your discipline, the scholars and the countries adopting this realist approach to international law came from those powerful blocs, because they are the ones who could afford that sort of language to international relations to tell us that when it comes to state interest, they should not really feel constrained by any external rules. And that is exactly how we ended up in the Second World War, when during the interwar period, the German international lawyers, including Carl Schmitt and all those people, Nazi international lawyers, they argued that sovereignty is so important and so powerful that it should not be confined and controlled and contained by any external body of rules called international law. Right? So it is a very elitist position in the sense that only powerful can make and advance this argument, because they have the capacity to live in a world which allows them to go and do whatever they want to do in the absence of that international rules and regulation that would bind them, even if that is imperial. Even if that imperial international law helps them, nonetheless, they want to go beyond that to advance their vested interest. Now, even if we agree that international law is very imperialist, we acknowledge it, we understand its colonial underpinning, the question is, do third world countries have the means and capacity in the way those imperial powers have to walk away from international law and live in a world that doesn't leave them with any protection whatsoever? Perhaps not. So the compromise that these countries and scholars as a whole had to think about is, okay, international law is imperialist, but is there any way we can participate rather than living it completely, participate and make it a bit better? Now, there was a moment of real hope, especially if you study the history of international law in the 1970s, when a good number of countries emerged as sovereign states. They occupied, in a symbolic way, UN General Assembly. And if you look into the resolutions that came out from the late 60s, early 70s, the Colonial Declaration, making very clearly and powerfully that colonialism is a violation of international law and we have to have decolonization, advocacy for right to self-determination, new international economic order, permanent sovereignty over natural resources, like saying that, okay, whatever preferential treaties former colonies had to sign under pressure with their colonial masters have no legal binding force. These new states, post-colonial states, have permanent sovereignty over their natural resources. So these are good examples. These are good examples where third world countries, newly established post-colonial states, wanted to be part of the international system and to make it better. That experiment didn't really work well, but nonetheless, compared to the very kind of UN Security Council arrangement, where 5 powerful countries with their veto power as permanent members, the way they dominate decision making, binding decision making there. Compared to that, you see General Assemblies has become a kind of global moral voice when it comes to the criticism of Israel or any action, climate justice also. I think there is some virtue, and you mentioned TWAIL, the kind of scholarship we are trying to do. I think it has some value in having this conversation and the conversation I'm having with you at the moment. If it can, to some extent, inspire future researchers in international law and also in the field of minority rights, and if they can ask difficult questions, challenging questions, I think gradually it is for all of us to take ownership and make the discipline better. So in that sense, I share Professor B.S. Chimney's hope, I would rather say a cautious hope in going on, in keeping up, in having this positivity in mind to keep fighting, because we cannot afford giving up completely.
Right. That was very hopeful. Okay, so moving on to the suggestions that you concluded your book with. Although you mentioned that the solutions you have presented should not be taken as, panacea, as complete solutions, or just a framework for further more work. I would just like to have a critical explanation from your side on that as well. So one of the powerful suggestions you made is moving towards regionalism. The question that came to my mind was while reading that was that European Union is traditionally seen as an example everyone should follow in terms of regional integration. However, European integration was clearly about economic interests. And as we see today in European politics as well, that European regionalism has not been successful in transcending nationalism. And people's loyalties are still strongly with their nation states, despite, transcending a lot of barriers of trade, capital, borders. So do you think European Union should be the example for South in terms of global regionalism? And also, the global South countries themselves have the potential to transcend these modern national boundaries and think and act beyond them?
Yeah, no. So first question is simple one. So I do not think Europe is a model for anything. Forget regionalism. And it is precisely why the reason we adopted this European nation-state model and enforced on us as part of international order making. So it is not an accident that most post-colonial states today look pretty much the same. I mean, they might have different names for their parliament, but structure-wise, it is more or less same. And this is not an accident, because this template was given to us as part of what is recognized as a legitimate structure and what is not, to emerge as a sovereign state. That is actually why these countries adopted these models and found themselves in this problem. So going back to the problem of minority, it is because of this European template taking an imposition of that particular model of law, of governance, adjudication, like the court system. And we had panchayat systems for thousands of years, peaceful way of solving disputes, right? Amicable village system of solving dispute. Now the court system was imposed, and after 200 years, we realized it's not working. Now the same World Bank and other donor agencies are spending millions for ADR, alternative dispute resolutions, right? Which happen to be our mainstream dispute settlement mechanism. So no, European Union, as you rightly said, it is not working for Europeans themselves, and there is no reason why that model should work for us. Forget it. But there is some virtue in really engaging or revisiting the colonial boundary sort of template that we adopted in a more organic, in a more principled way. And in the book, I articulated some of the ways in which that can be done. But at least we can agree on the idea that this notion of state, which we think in some sort of essentialist term, like we cannot imagine an international order without the very existence of state. But the irony is this imposition of state system is rather new if you think in terms of human history. James Scott very famously, his book, like The Art of Not Being Governed, like he's calling it an art, like some of the indigenous people in certain areas, leftover areas in the world, still how they are struggling to somehow stay outside the imposition of state boundaries, which is an art. So perhaps you have to agree that this statist model of international order is rather a new thing. We must not think about it in an absolutely essentialist term that it cannot be changed, or it's a kind of almost a crime to think about it in a different light. Fine. At the same time, having said all this, I agree that practically perhaps that is the best you can have. So if that is the case, then my invitation to my readers was to rethink the state itself then. If you don't want to reimagine the territorial boundary, Pakistan as it is, or India as it is, or Bangladesh as it is, if you don't want to go beyond that, but within the state boundaries, perhaps you can think about the state making in a different way by revisiting the history of the state itself, how the state came into being. So my invitation was to retell the history of the state itself, but from the point of view of the minorities, rather than from the ruling class elitist history of the state. I think that retelling of the history of the state has something more interesting to offer, because it is going to tell us how various minorities have been left out in this process of state making. And that is also why these ethnic and religious minorities are different from other categories of vulnerable groups, like disabled people, like women, like age-based discrimination, because those people, those or LGBT communities, whatever, those people, even if they are also the victims of hegemonic state and its ideology, those groups do not challenge the very legitimacy of the state, unlike minority groups. As I said at the beginning, minority groups, ethnic or religious, are always seen as a constant threat to the self-image of the majoritarian state. So if we think about the history of the state itself from minority point of view, I think people will have a better understanding about the context in which minority problem is created in the first place, and that will enable policymakers to make better concessions to those groups, and it will also be easier for the majority class, majority people, to accept various concessions made to minorities. It will be seen as far more palatable and less of a threat to the state's
Mm.
existence. That is the case today.
Right. Thank you. Okay, I guess that the next question was very much linked to the last question, and that was about colonial rethinking and reconsidering the colonial boundaries. So, if you can elaborate, because what we are talking about here is a scholarly discussion, and the way elites think of the post-colonial states, it's very different. So we can talk about scholarly reconsideration of boundaries in a way that is peaceful. But as far as the state is concerned, which is very much keen in keeping its territorial integrity, do you think it's practically possible to have a peaceful way of reconsidering colonial boundaries?
Absolutely. Because when there was massive bloodshed happening following the breaking up of Yugoslavia, so Bosnian genocide, Serbs are fighting back, Croatians, like it's going on. It's a very messy situation in the heart of Europe. At the same time, Czechoslovakia, they decided to break up, which later came to be known as the Velvet Separation. They say Czech Republic and Slovakia, they said, yeah, if we mutually agree to be separate, who on earth is going to prevent us? So they agreed. There was not a single blood drop in breaking up this country, and they are happily existing next to each other. So the obvious question that we have to ask ourselves about this artificial making and artificial centrality of this territorial notion of statehood, right? And again, it's a new concept. It's not a very old. So this territorial centrality, if we ask ourselves, so for example, think about Kashmir. These two countries, India and Pakistan, have been fighting over it for such a long time, right? And it has created so much trouble. And military elites, I understand they have their vested interest in any conflict going on in any part of the world because they're the ones, they find themselves in these central positions. Now, if you get rid of all those noise and just think quietly and peacefully and think, okay, so what is the core issue here actually? What is the problem? If you try to go back to the problem honestly, there is always a solution. And that is why the principal revisiting of territorial boundary, my solution was there. Like, so why does territory matter? So in the case of Rohingya, I mean, they are claiming a territory without the people. And that is the problem. So if you do not like these people, and if you don't want these people in your country, then let them have their own future. Because they are living on a territory, but the problem becomes Myanmar wants the territory, not the people. So same with the Kashmir problem. So there are people in Kashmir who want their own state, for example, because they think that's what they have always been. Now, two countries are claiming or having part of it and then fighting with each other. So there are ways in which you can think principally. For example, you can say, okay, it's for the people of Kashmir to decide what they want. And if they want their own state, that's fine. Let them have their own state. And it's not my problem anymore. I don't need to spend X amount of my budget on military expenditure. I can spend this on health. So it's a good thing actually for my people. Right? So people should ideally agree if they use their rational mind, but people won't because of those rhetorics that are in place. So your question, whether it is practically possible, my answer is yes, it is definitely practically possible. The problem is they don't want to do it. And why they don't want to do it, that takes us to some of the problems that we have discussed. This political organization, the very colonial politics itself, the way it was translated into elitist political culture. I did not have time to discuss this other element. I just simply talked about colonial origin, but colonial capitalism. Colonial capitalism is, which I discussed in great detail in the book, had a key role to play. So this religious division that caused the partition of India, creating India and Pakistan, and then Pakistan was breaking into pieces also when Bangladesh was created. In many part, it was all about the growth of bourgeoisie in Hindu community and Muslim community at different time of history, depending on who took the British benefits first, who learned English first. That paved the way for public jobs. Muslims came into this game after a long time. When Aligarh was established, that was the moment when Muslim elites thought we have to modernize ourselves, we have to work with the British, because for a long time they even thought learning English is a bad thing for Islam. So the growth of the two bourgeoisie class at different time created this problem of catching up. So when Muslim League was created, the initial issue was to negotiate with the British for preferential treatment. That if we compete in an open field, we can never catch up because Hindu ruling class is far advanced than us because we are latecomers in this game. So British rule then created certain affirmative action policies, if you like the term, in terms of electoral processes, separate electoral arrangement for Muslims, for Hindus, because that worked in their favor, certain quota in job, certain quota in parliament. So all sorts of things were designed to enable those educated middle class bourgeoisie to catch up with Hindu elite class. So both India and Pakistan and Bangladesh afterwards. So the creation of Bangladesh, I mean, of course, you talk about oppression and everything, but if you zoom in, you basically see the grievances of the middle class, educated middle class, because they complained about discrimination because their share of job in army, in bureaucracy was far less given their population size. So the population percentage does not reflect their share in public job in Pakistan, which was a case of discrimination, of course. But what you have common in both India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh is the core at the core issue is the kind of middle class elite grievances, right? But this small middle class, educated middle class, cannot fight back mighty colonial power or any oppressive power. For that, you need mass mobilization. And that is why majoritarian politics becomes so important. So elites like Gandhi or Nehru, Western educated elites, they could not on their own fight back the British and demand independence. They needed people. And when they needed people, essentially the Congress politics became a majoritarian Hindu politics. And that is also why Muslim politics became essentially Muslim politics, right? So remember two things. So these elites are mainly concerned about their own vested interests, but they need the mass people to have that mass mobilization so that they can fight back powerful enemy. But in this nationalist politics, and therefore to mobilize these people, they will always use these majoritarian languages, right? Islam, Hinduism, Bengali politics, Sinhalese nationalism. They always need that because that is something, the tonic that will mobilize these ordinary people. But at the same time, these elites will always deprive these or prevent these mass people from having any powerful say in the way politics is being operated. So you need them to get your own country, but the moment you have your own country, forget people, it is the same elite class, they will run the country in the way that suits them. Right? And it is fundamentally important that we understand the very origin of politics and the way this is elite capture of a nationalist movement, right? And that is also why these elites will never ask for any possible solution because they are the ones who benefit tremendously from ongoing conflicts. Whenever you see conflict, whenever you see one single bullet being fired anywhere in the world, just remember some people are making money out of it. Right? So I don't want to get into detail about this, but you know very well the institutions I'm thinking of.
Yeah, exactly. So that was an interesting analysis. Okay, let's move on to the other question of which is related to the humanitarian interventions that you talk about. So, if we see humanitarian interventions as solutions, um, don't you think that in this asymmetric political world order, it will simply legitimize the intervention by powerful states in weaker states in name of peace as well?
Yes, I agree. And I think in the book, I have also highlighted that point. So the dilemma is if a group of people like the Rohingya in Myanmar, for example, is experiencing genocide in the hands of the ruling class there, majoritarian class, also the army, what do we do for them? What does international law have to tell them to protect these people? Now, because they will be always claiming this territorial integrity, sovereignty, and sort of thing. And that is the real dilemma that we have. Because we have to respect territorial integrity and sovereign equality, because if we don't do that, then there's many of the smaller states won't simply exist, right? So the fact that smaller countries exist, they exist because of those important principles of territorial integrity and everything. We cannot open the floodgate and ask powerful countries like India, China, or the US to go and invade other smaller countries in the name of saving people. We have seen what has happened in Iraq. You literally kill millions in the name of democracy and human rights, right? So that is imperialism. And that language of humanitarian intervention is very imperialist, and that is also why third world countries are so nervous and worried about it. At the same time, the question would be, if you see people are being killed, what measures you have to save them? And that is the problem we have today, because the countries who have the capacity of saving people, right, the military power, the NATO bloc, for example, who intervened in the Bosnian case in the final days of genocide, they are also very much aware of their own calculations, their own vested interests. So before going for that sort of intervention, they will do their own political calculation. And so unless there is an agreed way out, agreed principle at the UN level, for example, and there has been some efforts to that direction. People have been talking about right to protect R2P. There was an effort at the UN level with the initiative of Ban Ki-moon to come up with a framework. But the same old problem when it comes to at any UN level action, it is always stuck because of that five great powers and their own power political stance. So it remains as a dilemma. And in the book, I couldn't really do much more than highlighting these bifurcating tendencies, highlighting the importance and the limitations of both. Because in my right mind, I cannot really advocate for a kind of open-ended humanitarian intervention principles, which will give a blank check to various imperial powers to do that. But at the same time, I'm also mindful of various groups and what needs to be done to protect them in extreme situations like the Rohingya.
Specifically in terms of powerful states, like we see regional powers, Uyghurs, for example, Muslims in India, or there is an impeding, genocidal calls. So specifically, even in the case of Myanmar, we saw that there were some powers that were, kind of having the backing of for their own vested interest. So when powerful states are involved, things become very difficult. Is that the case?
It's true, and in all major conflicts, some protracted conflicts like the Kashmir one, the Palestine issue that is going on for a long time, Myanmar you mentioned. So you will see, going back to your previous interesting question, whether it is practically possible to solve this problem. The answer is yes. But then why you have the problem? You have the problem because these vested interest groups, global capitalist class, they have interest in this ongoing conflict. So this Israel-Palestine conflict helps US to have a very predominant role in foreign policy aspects in the Middle East, right? So when people have their vested interest in conflicts, even if it is practically possible to have peace, you are not going to have that because they have interest. And in all such conflicts, these conflicts continue because certain powerful countries, using international law mechanisms, they side with the oppressor and let the conflicts get worse because they benefit from that. Now, what can be done? One thing that we can do is to have a powerful civil society. And at the end, I think even if you don't have the means and powers to make policy changes at the international level, but at least it can work as a powerful moral voice, irrespective of US supreme military power and the way it subjugated Saddam Hussein's regime within a matter of months. It is the global civil society that held the USA and UK bloc accountable, and the critique is still going on. USA and UK still has to justify. They could not simply say, we did that because you are powerful. We did that because you have the military means to do that. They had to invent a legal language, first with a WMD, and then humanitarian language, then democracy, then saving Iraqi women. So it is this pressure from the civil society that even forced these powerful countries to justify their action. So I think we have to keep going because there is virtue in having that moral voice. And if we keep going on, even if we are not really a match in terms of the power that as a collective we have, nonetheless, it works as a check. And that at least gives us a avenue to critique what is wrong, even if that sounds very helpless and very compromising. Nonetheless, that's what we have.
Yeah, I get you. At least we can be a struggling force and in opposition to such brutalities. Right. Moving on to, I guess, one of the last questions. We see that the campaigns of the otherization campaigns that dehumanizes the minority groups have mostly domestic political reasons. They're used as election winning tools. So we have seen in countries like hate mongering and spreading fear has been very effective and successful election winning tools. So what role do you see of international law in shaping this political dynamics in these countries?
Yes, so first, as I say, the kind of ideas like good governance, like democracy, and various other economic policies coming from International Monetary Fund. And so if you think about this as a kind of good package and the kind of economic structure that is put in place within which these electoral politics are being played, then you will actually see why it happens. So for me, the point of departure would be people don't fight with each other simply because people are hateful by nature.
Yes.
Right? It's not that. If that is the case, then there is no question of human rights or peace or anything. I mean, if we accept that people are fundamentally hateful, people simply, any Muslim cannot accept the idea that their next door neighbor would be a Hindu or a Christian. Or if we accept that for a Hindu citizen in India, it would be absolutely absurd to live next to a Muslim or whatever. It is in their DNA and it is fundamentally impossible. Then there is no question of peace or hope. The idea would be, okay, either you make ghetto or different states for. So I don't believe that is what human beings are, because human history tells us that we lived peacefully. And if people, same Homo sapiens, can live peacefully in other countries, if they can live peacefully in Leicester, although they had a riot, but that's a different story, or in Birmingham, or in Toronto, why they cannot live in Delhi or in Karachi, right? So it's not about our human DNA, it's something else. So then perhaps we can investigate what is that else. That takes us to two things. One is the economic structure, economic exploitation, and who get to exploit. And secondly, how politics plays a role in making that exploitation happen. So if you have limited resources, think about like X number of jobs. So one idea would be that you distribute this job on the basis of quality. People who are the most qualified to get the job. So that should be kind of ideal position. But this idea of qualification or quality is not a value-free notion, because the quality itself or qualification itself is a product of how much was invested in you at what stage of your life. So, for example, if someone comes from an affluent family in Karachi and someone comes from a very small town and they sit for an exam with the same question set, but the per capita investment in their education processes were very different. Their life experience have been different, so they perform in a very different way. So you see, kind of even the idea of qualification is tainted with this idea of a class character of human experience. Now, this class character, who belongs to that class, who has the capacity to capture bigger portion of that pie, is linked to the question of politics, because in most cases, as I explained earlier, the political class coincide with the ruling capitalist class, who control the means and tools of state machinery in the form of military elites, in the form of bureaucratic elites, in the form of feudal lords. Like, so in the case of Pakistan, just think in terms of families, how many families actually control land in Punjab, for example, and what is the connection between these families and the military elites and political elites, right? So the story would be pretty much same in India and in Bangladesh and all other places. So this question of economic structure is closely connected to the political structure. The question is, who has the capacity to capture and grab bigger share, disproportionately bigger share of the pie, the resources? When elites do that, then you are left with a very tiny portion of resources available for all other mass people, who will also now be competing with each other for the resources. And politics, especially democracy, becomes a very important and interesting tool in which you can create demagogues who will be using those languages, vicious languages, to mobilize people, not only to fight the elites, but also, as I said, to fight elites, you need mass people. And to bring mass people as your followers, you need that sort of languages, majoritarian languages. And it is this language that makes these divisions possible, right? So the simple response to your interesting question is, we have to take political economy seriously if we want to understand ethnic politics in not only in South Asia, all over the world. It is not that people simply hate each other. We have to understand the very economic understanding or economic analysis of that behavior and the role elites play in creating that thing. I mean, why would a rational human being who would not sacrifice their life for any amount of money because they understand the value of their life, why that rational human being would go on street and kill someone they know from their childhood in the name of religion, in the name of language, in the name of nationality? Why? What explains that? So that explanation is largely about elite mobilization for their own vested interest. It is also about that resource constraints and the competition over that resources, and the way the interpolitical and economic structure was created in post-colonial states because of colonial experience. Collectively, these offer a beautiful picture for us to understand why people behave in the way they do. Because I refuse the idea that people are simply hateful. They hate each other, and it's not possible to live peacefully together. So the answer remains not in just telling people, love your neighbor, because they are like you, we have the same blood. You have to do more than that. We have to understand the structural injustices, structural issues of economy and of politics. So in short, the political economy of violence and discrimination.
Right. Thank you. That was very telling about economic structural injustices that you pointed out. So if you have time, we can have one more question, if you allow.
Sure. One last question.
One last question. I was curious about fourth world approaches to international law. So can you just briefly explain, if you have read about third world approaches, so what are the fourth world approaches?
So the idea is, contrary to the mainstream approaches to international law, which predominantly rely on European experience, and therefore we call it Eurocentric international law, third world approaches came into being to challenge that mainstream thinking about international law and relations, and to put the experiences of the global south at the center. Now, in the process, what we see that the TWAIL approach predominantly focus on the state itself, the third world post-colonial state itself, and their experiences vis-a-vis former colonies and their domination, and the way various international institutions, including financial institutions, continue to rely on colonial structure and marginalize third world sovereignty. So that has been the main focus of TWAIL scholarship. So my research wanted to fill an important gap by highlighting this idea of the marginal group within the third world state, so minority. And fourth world approaches to international law is actually a continuation of that invites us to look into internal colonialism within post-colonial states, the way post-colonial elites establish a colonial rule vis-a-vis their own people, especially minorities, and I think. So that is why they are talking about fourth world, because these subaltern groups should be seen as a fourth world within the third world. So that is, in short, explains the fourth world approach to international law, to think about coloniality at different levels.
That is very interesting and intriguing. And thank you, Dr. We are in forever debt to you for the amount of time and effort you contributed for this interview. And we learned very much, and we learned very much new approaches, actually. And I strongly believe that your research would contribute to, further more strong research, which would, contribute to the subaltern efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thanks to South Asia Research Institute for Minorities. And I wish you all the best with your work. Thank you.